Everyone knows, Spartans were the most feared warriors in the ancient world. They were taken from their mothers at age 7, trained to feel no pain, taught to sleep on reeds they cut with their bare hands. By the time a Spartan picked up a shield, he had already survived years of beatings, starvation, and things most grown men couldn't handle. The world was terrified of them. But here's the thing nobody tells you. The Spartans were terrified too. Not of Persia, not of Athens, not of any army that ever marched against them. They were terrified of the people cooking their food, farming their land, and sleeping just outside their walls. To understand this, you have to understand something the movie 300 never showed you. Sparta didn't run itself. Behind every warrior doing push-ups in the sun, there was someone else doing the actual work. Growing the food, building the homes, keeping the city alive. These people were called the Helots, and they weren't hired workers or paid servants. They were slaves, conquered Greeks from a region called Messenia, forced to serve Sparta after losing a war centuries earlier. And here's the number that should stop you cold. The Spartans drilled constantly and remained under arms at all times, largely because they were terrified the Helots would revolt. For every one Spartan warrior, there were roughly 7 Helots. Think about that. You're outnumbered 7-1 by people who hate you, who live inside your city, who know exactly where you sleep. That's not a slave population. That's a bomb with a long fuse. So how did Sparta manage this? They used fear. Constant, calculated, deliberate fear. The Helots were subjected to various degradations, forced drunkenness, demeaning public spectacles, and ritual murder as part of a Spartan coming-of-age ceremony. Spartan boys were shown drunk Helots as a warning of what weakness looked like. But the darkest part was something called the Krypteia. The Krypteia can be best described as a type of secret task force whose aim was to hunt down and kill particularly strong and able Helots. These were the best young Spartan fighters, the elite of the elite, and their job wasn't to fight armies. It was to move through the countryside at night, in secret, and eliminate any Helot who seemed too capable, too bold, too dangerous. Think about what that tells you. The world's greatest warriors were spending their nights quietly eliminating farmers, because those farmers scared them that much. Thucydides writes that the Spartans once gathered the most industrious and spirited Helots under the false pretense they would be set free. 2,000 came forward and were then disappeared. 2,000 people, gone. No one knew how each of them died. This wasn't a one-time event. This was policy. Here is where it gets deeply ironic. This fear of the Helots kept Spartan soldiers at home, preventing Sparta from using its army abroad as often as it might have, the very thing that made Sparta powerful. Its army was pinned down by paranoia. They couldn't go too far. They couldn't stay away too long. Because if the Helots rose up while the warriors were gone, it was over. And it almost happened multiple times. After a massive earthquake in 464 BC, the Helots saw their moment and revolted. It took years and outside help from Athens to put it down. In 371 BC, the Thebans defeated the Spartans at the Battle of Leuctra and freed Messenia and her thousands of enslaved Helots. Within a few short years, without the workforce of the slaves supporting the Spartan system, the structure of society and its military excellence crumbled. The thing Spartans feared most, losing control of the Helots, is exactly what destroyed them. Not a foreign army, not a better warrior, their own secret. We talk about Spartans like they were a force of nature, fearless, unstoppable. But the truth is, they built their entire civilization on a foundation they were terrified would collapse. They trained their sons to be the toughest humans alive, and then sent those sons out at night, not to fight empires, but to quietly make sure the people they depended on most never got brave enough to fight back. The Spartans weren't just warriors, they were people living in fear, and they turned that fear into a system. Did you think I was done? Because we haven't even talked about what happened inside Sparta's walls. And honestly, that's where it gets really strange. Let's go back to the beginning, not the battlefield, the nursery. When a Spartan baby was born, it wasn't handed to its mother. It was handed to a group of elders. They would inspect it, limbs, weight, appearance. If the baby seemed weak, sickly, or imperfect in any way, it wasn't taken home. It was left on a hillside to die. This wasn't considered cruel in Sparta. It was considered practical. You don't build the world's greatest army by raising children who might slow it down. Only the strong ones made it home, and even then, home wasn't really home for long. At age 7, the state came to collect them. Not for school, not for sports camp, for the Agoge. A system so brutal that modern military training looks relaxed by comparison. Boys were deliberately underfed, not by accident, on purpose. The logic was simple. A hungry soldier is a resourceful soldier. So they were told to steal food to survive. But here's the catch. If you got caught stealing, you were beaten, not for stealing, for getting caught. because a Spartan who gets caught is a Spartan who is sloppy, and sloppy gets people killed. They slept on reeds, they cut themselves from the river, with no tools, just their hands, no mattress, no blanket, in winter. They added thistle to the reeds. Apparently the prickling was supposed to keep them tough. For 13 years, this was their life. By the time a Spartan boy became a man, he hadn't just been trained to fight, he had been reprogrammed. Pain was normal, hunger was normal, discomfort was normal. Everything that would break an ordinary person had already been thrown at him, and he was still standing. That was the point. Now, here's something that nobody expects when they learn about Spartans. These terrifying warriors, men who had survived over a decade of the harshest training in the ancient world, were reportedly very awkward around women, because they had spent their entire lives living, eating, sleeping, and training exclusively with other men. So Sparta came up with one of the strangest wedding rituals in all of human history. On the wedding night, the bride would have her head shaved, then she'd be dressed in men's clothing, then she'd be left alone in a dark room, and the groom would sneak in. Historians believe this was done deliberately, to ease the Spartan warrior into the experience of being with a woman, by making her look as much like a fellow soldier as possible at first glance. It gets stranger. After the wedding, the husband didn't move in, he went back to the barracks. Sneak out at night to visit his wife, and sneak back before dawn like he was on a covert military operation, because in a way, to him, he was. Some Spartan men became fathers before they ever saw their wives in daylight. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who could face a Persian army without blinking was sneaking around his own city at night, because spending the night at home felt too unfamiliar. And while we're talking about things the movies got wrong, let's talk about Spartan women, because they were unlike any other women in the ancient world. While women in Athens were expected to stay indoors, stay quiet, and stay out of public life entirely, Spartan women were out running, wrestling, and training, not to become warriors, but because Sparta believed that strong mothers produced strong children, and strong children became strong soldiers. Spartan women owned property. They managed the household finances, while their husbands lived in barracks. They could speak freely, in public, which was practically unheard of in the rest of Greece, and they were ruthless about the warrior code. There's a famous story, and this one has been passed down for centuries, of a Spartan mother sending her son off to battle. She handed him his shield and said 5 words: with it, or on it. Come back carrying your shield as a victor, or come back lying on it, carried by your fellow soldiers as a dead hero. Don't come back without it. That would mean you dropped it, to run, and no Spartan mother was raising a runner. So how does a civilization this hard, this disciplined, this ruthless, fall? Slowly. Then all at once. The same system that made Sparta powerful, made it fragile. Every single part of Spartan society depended on one thing: numbers. Enough warriors to hold the line. Enough Helots controlled to keep the food coming. Enough babies born strong enough to pass the inspection at birth. And over time, all three started failing simultaneously. Wars killed warriors faster than they could be replaced. The Helot revolt, after the earthquake of 464 BC, weakened the state badly, and Spartan men weren't allowed to marry until age 30, which meant fewer children, born later, to replenish the losses. At Sparta's peak, the army had around 9,000 full Spartan citizens by the time the Thebans came calling in 371 BC. That number had collapsed to just 700. 700 men trying to hold together a system built for 9,000. They couldn't. The Battle of Leuctra broke them. The Helots were freed, and without the enslaved population farming the land and feeding the machine, the entire Spartan way of life had no foundation to stand on. The civilization that had terrorized the ancient world for centuries didn't end with a dramatic last stand. It just ran out of people. Here's what I want you to take away from all of this. Sparta is always sold to us as the ultimate power fantasy. No fear, no weakness, no limits. But real Sparta was something far more complicated, and honestly, far more interesting. It was a society so afraid of collapse that it built fear into everything. The training, the marriage rituals, the secret death squads, the way they treated the people they depended on most. They were afraid of their slaves rising up, afraid of their own sons being too weak, afraid of being caught off guard, afraid of what would happen if any single part of the system cracked. And in the end, it all cracked anyway.